now. So I hope. Did you receive a message that recording is under progress? Yes. Thank you. Okay, so welcome everybody to our lecture series on decolonial practices in and across academia at the University of Leipzig, jointly organized by the Institute of African Studies and the Institute for Social Anthropology. We are very happy to have Dr. Rano Turaeva as our speaker today. She is coming live from Tashkent, where she is currently on a research trip and also on a conference visit. So Rano is currently finishing her habilitation or her second book at the Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich. So she has a habilitation stipend. She finished her PhD at the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology and at the Martin Luther University in Halle-Wittenberg in 2010. So she was between 2005 to 2010, she was a PhD student in Halle, focusing on rural to urban migration within Uzbekistan, and also on dynamics of identification of Khwarezmian migrants in Tashkent. So this project was published in 2016 as a book, Migration and Identity, the Uzbek Experience. It came out with Routledge. Afterwards, she had several positions in the Institute for International Development Cooperation in Bonn, and then also in the Institute for Area Studies, Leibniz Institute for Area Studies in Leipzig, where she coordinated and participated in numerous research projects related also to infrastructure development and also to mining cities, former mining cities. And then in 2015, she started her habilitation project on Central Asian migrants in Russia, and particularly on the influence of Islamic communities or ways of bonding in Russian cities, particularly in Moscow and in Perm. So where she did extensive field research over the years, living with people on the ground in marginal spaces in the Trabant cities of Moscow, for instance. She is currently finalizing this project. She submitted her book draft, or she's submitting it very soon for the second project. And in between, she was already also very productive editing a volume in 2021 on, sorry, can you other guys switch off your microphones? Thank you. So she edited a book in 2021 together with Rüstemcan Urinboyev from Lund University on labor mobilities and informal practices, power institutions and mobile actors in transnational space. And she also has a special issue in the sociology of Islam on halal economies, besides many other journal articles she published in the recent years. So we're very fortunate to have her. And without further ado, I will give the floor to you, Rano, for your presentation on double colonial heritage and the questions of decolonizing Asian studies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very delighted to speak here today, and I'm really happy that I got this opportunity to share my ideas that have been in my mind since last years. And thank you very much, Markus, for a very extensive introduction of my work, so I don't have to do that at least and save time. Yeah, I finished my habilitation, as Markus said, so I can concentrate on other stuff, and that's what I would like to talk today is those ideas that I would like to develop further also. So I didn't change any title, so what is appearing on the first slide above the title is the citation from reviewers that I received on the shortened format of the same ideas that I sent to Anthropology today. I put it there because I think it was really still keeps me busy, and I think about these things and I take it serious. So I put several of the quotations that would accompany my thoughts today during my talk, and one of them is this reviewer that I cite here. So for me it was important to think about it, because obviously Anthropology Today editors also accepted this kind of review. And what he says, that it's not possible to decolonize such disciplines which are based on colonialism, is very important to think about, I think. So I organized my talk in the following manner, namely, I would like to think about what others think about the same things, and then reflect on those ideas said and stated by others on these questions, referring to my own experiences and my own knowledge and my own concerns within this field of living, acting, thinking, reflecting decolonially. And if this will be doable, I think, I don't know. I would like to successfully continue this project and make my own contribution within the process of decolonizing anthropology of Central Asia. So I would like, as I said, to delve into this problematic of, I quote from, actually impossibility of decolonizing such subjects which have been initially colonial projects, as the reviewer stated already, and rightly maybe, or partially stated the bitter reality of this kind of heritage. So Linda Smith has early on set the standard for decolonizing research with her famous dictum that research is a dirty word for most indigenous people around the world. Feminists, decolonial thinkers, authors of writing culture debate, authors of post-colonial debate, and many others made their point very clearly and very loudly, that things, at least within such critical subjects or disciplines like anthropology, cannot continue existing in the same modus as it was decades ago. So we have another century, and we still only do the talking with minor change, in my eyes at least, such as within the field of African studies or Latin American anthropology, for example, but not in anthropology in Central Asia. Since the times of anti-colonial activism and questioning the writing culture and crisis of representation, the only change, at least I can see, is that names changed, such as we don't talk about the Third World anymore, rather the Global South, for example. The same goes for the institutional setting of knowledge production, where white male-dominating discourse dictates the rules of academic knowledge production, distribution of power, and career paths. The same goes for the representation. The same goes for the representation of scientific writing, where printing became a business of its own. And the printing business sets the requirements for a certain style of writing, such as citing prominent works, shared norms of recognition of a certain kind of authorities, of a certain kind of topics, which is also decided in top-down manner. An author who is not following these requirements is not granted an entrance card within the printing business. People of color, or those who cannot at least eloquently master the language of colonial power, do not easily make it to the first-class printing houses, which opens the door, obviously, within career paths. So, among many writers of decolonialism, decoloniality, and coloniality/modernity, Guijana's works, at least, stand out as the most sophisticated approaches to the frameworks for analyzing coloniality/decoloniality using his triad model outlined in his phrase, I quote, colonial power matrix, or in Spanish, it's patrón de poder colonial. which covers such fields as sexuality, authority, subjectivity, and labor. Describing this power matrix of Guyana, Grossvogel, for example, writes, I quote, "The 16th century initiates a new global colonial power matrix that by the late 19th century came to cover the whole planet." End of quote. General attributions of the colonial power matrix include all kinds of evils of capitalism and global domination systems. And here I quote Walsh, who nicely summarized it in the following, I quote, "The visible dynamics of accumulation of global capital, including drug mafias, mega transnational projects, for example, energy and tourism, extractivism, water and land contamination, deterritorialization, violence, and death," end of quote. Guijano's definition of colonial property of power is two-sided and in reference to modernity and capitalism, namely around ideas of race and organization of labor, including slave labor and capital accumulation. Later, prominent writers of decolonial concepts and decoloniality, such as Mignolo and Walsh, who provided a book length of description of concepts and models, including the discussion of methodological, epistemic, and as what they call pedagogical aspects of living, working, and reflecting, using decoloniality lens, drawing on a big community of scholars, activists, thinkers from South America, and stated that their works are, I quote, "communal project in its initial composition was primarily based in South America and the United States." And they give a very long list of these activists and scientists, and I know many of them, like Grossvogel and Guyano and Torres, and etc. So there are also important distinctions that they make between same-rooted concepts, such as colonialism, which is different from coloniality, or decolonization from decoloniality. So Mignolo and Walsh define colonialism as constitutive of imperialism, whereas decolonialism is different from decoloniality, as Mignolo defines. Decolonialism referring to Wikipedia definition, namely undoing colonialism. Mignolo provides a very long history of decolonization happening in several waves, with initial forms of revolutions and struggles for independence. Furthermore, he shows a process of, I quote, "mutation from decolonization to decoloniality." Mignolo further argues that, I quote, "coloniality of knowledge remained in place in all those cases, also transformed in their content and regulation by means in the Americas of institutions like universities, museums, convents, and monasteries," end of quote. Decoloniality by the same authors are further defined here, I quote Walsh, as, I quote, "ways of thinking, knowing, being, and doing that began with, but also precede the colonial enterprise and invasion," end of quote, as well as actively standing out against, I quote, "the hierarchical structures of race, gender, heteropatriarchy, and class that continue to control life, knowledge, spirituality, and thought structures that are clearly intertwined with and constitutive of global capitalism and Western modernity," end of quote. Furthermore, decoloniality is not a theoretical framework, but rather approach to analytical thinking, acting, and doing, and theorizing based on praxis. So she noted, I quote, that decoloniality emerged from the shortcomings of decolonialization. Decoloniality has been a more useful term because on the way it brings to the fore coloniality and the modern colonial matrix of power, end of quote. Furthermore, Mignolo clarifies that, I quote, "coloniality, the darker side of Western modernity, is a decolonial concept and therefore the anchor of decolonial thinking and doing in the praxis of living. So in the recent volume, which you see here, edited by Monika Albrecht, authors revisit and critically discuss post-colonialism and decolonial scholarship, pointing to reductive character of the literature, particularly reiteration of the divide between West and non-West, as well as supporting nationalist movements who also make often post-colonial arguments for their political projects on the ground. Here, Offelmann, in the same volume, in his case study of post-Soviet post-colonialism, shows how post-colonial theory, particularly Said's book, served political projects of what he calls radical nationalists. This volume is from 2020. Further examples are also brought by Albrecht, such as Said Orientalism, supporting to reshape of, I quote, Arab stereotypes of the West, feeding into a politics of resentment against the West, end of quote. Another critical point outlined by the same critical discussions that I just discussed is also the similar references of decolonial scholarship as post-colonial literature is to birth of modernity and the concept of race, as well as the criticism is about double standards mentioned by these authors in relation to the critical analysis of Western imperialisms, but not other imperialisms. The same critique is applied to the so-called post-colonial scholarship, which is centered around what Narayan calls big bad West, as imperialisms are only Western and not Eastern or Southern. Joining this critical scholarship, which underlines the importance of consideration of imperialisms and colonialisms, not only focusing on Western or North Atlantic colonialisms and imperialisms, but generally coloniality, which is generally fed with the power of domination and power of knowledge production. I would like to focus on double colonial heritage in the context of former Soviet countries, and particularly southern parts of the former Soviet Union, namely post-Soviet Central Asia. Large part of the decolonial scholarship is based on particularly colonial history of struggles against colonizers and ongoing struggles against violent Western models, which brought a lot of destructions of lands, nature, traditions, and local knowledge, which also led to the dark colors of defining modernity. I see, read, imagine, and know many dark experiences told about modernity and modern projects in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, which share largely the experiences, which also prompt such adjectives as, if using Mignolo's phrasing, dark side of modernity, which is not necessarily, for example, shared by Soviet experiences of современность. Современность is as a Russian word for modernity. Here I refer to a very specific form of modernity promoted by Soviets during the Soviet Union. And by many, particularly in those regions, and particularly by the women. Soviet modernity or современность has its own dark sides, of course, when one carefully considers all the facets behind those ideological projects of the Soviets, for instance, performed in Central Asia. In post-Soviet Central Asia, the Soviet project of modernization was largely positively remembered by many women, depending, of course, on the period of Soviet rule, such as not earlier experiences of building the modernity, but rather those who enjoyed the fruits of those modern projects, such as accessing education, employment opportunities for women in Central Asia. So I would not take the one-sided analysis of the modernity and rather suggest various experiences of the same modernity advanced by the power holders who had their own ideological, political, and economic interests behind those modern projects. The differences should be made between the planners of modernity, which could be largely unified as self-interest oriented and elite ideology based on the principles of destruction of original existence, of locales and peoples, from the experience of the same projects, from the side of populations and places where those modern projects have been conducted. These experiences of different modernities are diverse, told by many in different terms, negative, positive, neutral, depending on their age, country of origin, location of the same experiences, time, sex, and other identity markers one could have. I'm not sure if I would like to enter those discussions about modernity, to situate Soviet modernity, современность, within those debates. I guess I will have to finalize these readings because the already English language scholarship on modernity alone is so huge, and I'm not talking about the Russian language scholarship or other languages that I speak, for example, at least Uzbek and Turkmen. In Turkmen, it would be interesting to go into maybe a Turkmen classics of Mahdum Kuli, one of my favorite authors who writes in prose, and one of the most critical writers I know besides Chingiz Khan.
Sorry, this was a disturbance, sorry.
So I will try to include this discussion on modernity and the scholarship on modernity in the text version of this talk, depending on how much of this literature I can finish, of course. But I will go back again to Mignolo and others writing about decoloniality, and particularly after reading the recent book by Mignolo and Walsh, which I briefly discussed to address the problems I faced personally, and also maybe thinking in terms of regional differences and other kind of colonial histories and other kinds of complexities not fitting the frameworks discussed by the same authors. I'm afraid in real world, as everybody knows, obviously, neatly boxed or shelved categories do not always work, where some frameworks might fit in one context, but not others. Joining the later critical discussions of decoloniality scholarship and calls for multi-directional analysis and intersectional analysis, I refer here to Albrecht and Daswani, of such important aspects of power and domination in relation to coloniality, such as, for example, Guyana's coloniality of power, I argue that from my own knowledge and experience of colonial matrix of power, it's necessary to distinguish between the levels of analysis for judging coloniality as well as decoloniality, and differentiating those who benefit from both and who has what interest and from what positioning actors, groups, collectives, discuss, plan, and analyze these complex processes. Decolonial thinkers call for de-Westernization, decolonization, de-linking from capitalist models, etc. So I'm not in any way trying to devaluate this important mission of decolonizing, but I call for a more nuanced and better reflected analysis of decolonizing projects and activities. The analytical tools, methodological aspects are still not yet right, needing more empirical examples to advance our thinking about coloniality or neocolonization, as Albrecht also talks about. Today's forms of domination, power regimes. To show some of the problems I had, referring to the regions where I come from and the regions I know, I give some very simple examples. Maybe you can help me with further thinking about this kind of issues. It's not a real example. Yeah, it's a real example, but just I simplify it. So when an Afghan expert, a researcher or scholar who is a white and male will advance an argument that white colonial supremacy ended in Afghanistan. Taliban came to power and people should themselves decide who should be their leaders. It might be analyzed as de-Westernization, a first step of decolonial project. To get rid of Western colonizers, their Western ideas of government form, Western ideas about gender, education, modern lives, whatever it is, etc. All the ills of capitalism, market relations, market economies, whatever. So in this very specific context, I would not be happy as a woman or a girl who cannot choose what education, what lifestyle she would like to choose, and if she wants to marry with 7. Of course, this is an extreme example, of course, but real example, but much relevant, obviously, as I also come from the neighboring region and having friends and their families living in Afghanistan. Let us also take, another example in Uzbekistan in Central Asia, which had more than 70 years of Soviet experience, which can be easily analyzed or is largely analyzed as colonial and imperial, where Russians advanced their own ideas or their own ways of modernizing people in Central Asia. Post-Soviet Central Asia further experienced Westernization, Anglo-American universities opened, etc., as well as Arabization, leading visually more and more men wearing beards, women reveiling from traditional veiling to Arabic style of hijab veiling, and etc. So applying decolonial frameworks, one can also find darker side of Russian modernity, coloniality, and all of it, Soviet, Western, Arab influence, or forced ideologies into the Central Asian territories and peoples where the former part is a part of colonial matrix of power and needs to be decolonized, liberated from the domination of these ideologies. So due to the mixture of different ideologies, such as here we have Western modern democracy, other development within civil society, and then versus Arabization or reveiling. So one wonders what needs to be done, what needs to be fought against, what would be authentic Uzbek, Tajik, Kyrgyz, Kazakh, Turkmen. Are we going to join Russians and use decolonial or post-colonial theories to support nationalism? Another problem would be what values or ideologies are good for whom? As an Uzbek national who grew up in the Soviet times and studying in post-Soviet times, conducting anthropological study in later post-Soviet time, and experiencing Arabization periods, of course my analysis of those experiences will be biased, since I'm myself a современный modern Soviet modern woman with feminist ideas, living as a minority member in a European country, trained in all whatever Western, non-Western, local, Russian scientific ideological frameworks, which of course influence my analysis as well. Alongside my own parents, who still maintain Soviet nostalgia, I would find more benefits of Soviet modernization projects embodied in myself and my parents against Arabic influence and against Russian domination in the post-Soviet period. So I could imagine making good use of Guijano's thinking of coloniality of power, whereas largely basing my definitions of power by Foucault in general. So Taliban in Afghanistan claims to de-Westernize their country, governance, politics, economies, and Taliban project is considered with decolonial lens of decolonization, de-Westernization could qualify as a decolonial project. So the same example of Uzbekistan, that the discussion about forced unveiling was violent and women died in the process, is also complex. Who could be clearly against Russian modernity projects when using decolonial lens and now reveiling under Arabic influence could then also be the same problematic, which bottom-up movements would contribute to what kind of decolonial project, unveiling, reveiling, and which is more colonial and what is good for women and for whom. So based on these very complex examples and not an easy answer to these developments in the above cited locations, it's better to, I think, differentiate between coloniality and decoloniality by whom, for what, as the authors also rightly emphasized in their outline of decoloniality projects and activities, reflections, and what they called pedagogies. It's also helpful. It's also helpful to keep the basis of the basis of the decolonial thinking in the complex concept of power and its colonial quality, which can then differentiate those who are in power to act, think, enact coloniality, and those who are not in these positions, and therefore joins decolonial efforts to side with those who share this positioning. One aspect is obviously not to forget, is also mentioned by the same authors, as dangers of decoloniality and temptation of playing a victim card. So this leads me to the questions of positioning again, and the question of identity politics. Here I would like to come back to my own positioning and try to find the right way to be able to follow decolonial thinking and also acting. Who is white, Western, largely main colonial figure? Positioning, identity, sex, age, etc. obviously matters for defining decolonial strategies. Here I would like to stop on Daswani's intersectional definition of whiteness, which is important to move away from simplistic understanding of whiteness as Euro-American white male, which is often the center of decoloniality discussions as well as post-colonial theories. Daswani's definition opens up the same category for a wider interpretation of whiteness through intersectional analysis of powerful location, educational background, positioning within elite academic hierarchies. The widening of the same category or call for a better understanding of white supremacy, well, I would say general supremacy, if I analyze Arab or Pashtun supremacy, which is not enacted only by those who are white or male, but allowing also possibility of non-white individuals, whatever they are, who exercise domination and colonial behavior. Here it would be necessary to compare Baba's mimicry of the colonized, who becomes, I quote, almost the same but not white, end of quote. So with some differences in the perspectives, such as colonizer would see the mimicked as a danger who could or would talk back, as well as the differences in example of Baba's, the mimicking is done to survive and mimicking is external only. So in the case of Daswani's observation of whitening of blacks or mimicking the colonizer is not necessarily only external, but rather becoming white, I would say becoming colonial or exercise supremacy from within, both unconsciously and preconsciously. I'm not an expert on psychological analysis, I mean Freud here, of human behaviors, but the use of Freud's unconscious by most of decolonial, post-colonial, and neo-colonial writers is a bit problematic to me, both methodologically, ethically, and anthropologically. Maybe I don't know much of Freud, but Freud's unconscious, as much as I know, implies naturalness of unconscious part of the human mind, which predefines adults' behaviors alongside with preconscious, fed with information and knowledge, and conscious, which is a reflective mind. For me, as an anthropologist, in the field of human mind is a black box. It's difficult to make any judgments about the behavior of humans without being properly trained in deep psychology. Also, psychology, to my understanding of psychology, or as a discipline and praxis, operates with much of psychological issues locked in black box. So going back to again to Central Asia, I would like to bring some examples where decolonizing work needs to be conducted, or where coloniality of power is much expressed and present. Central Asia, the region where I come from and where I did my ethnographic research, has not yet Central Asia, the region where I come from and did my ethnographic research, has not yet even arrived there where anthropologists within African studies or Latin American anthropology did. The colonial heritage of the region is multi-layered, or one could also state that the region has a double colonial heritage. First, the region was made into 5 republics by Soviet government out of nomadic and sedentary populations ethnically or tribally intermixed throughout the long history, also full of other colonization experiences before the Russians came into the region. Second, post-Soviet period was marked with Western domination alongside with remaining Russian domination over political, economic, and academic fields. And Arab influence in the region is becoming more and more visible, as I said. The Soviet ethnographers studied the region to be able to govern it. And after collapse of the Soviet Union, Western scholars came to dictate their visions of development. Clash of knowledge traditions between Soviet ethnographia and Western anthropology resulted in other debates, which are still continuing. One of the prominent authors there, our colleague Florian Mulfred, who engaged with Russian ethnographers. And they edited also several volumes and publications together. So I also a little bit participated in those debates with Russian colleagues just last year in a Russian research institute where I was invited to contribute to discussing decolonial theories, where different issues were at stake. Also, the empirical examples for discussing decolonial theories in this meeting was Central Asia, and I'm, as a native Uzbek, I was still introduced by Russian colleagues in this seminar as an anthropologist coming from Western University. So I had to admit that academically I was socialized with mainstream Western theories, of course, but I have a different approach to my work and my writings as well as my teaching, considering my status like with no tenure track or no permanent contract within Western academia, where my knowledge brings, in my eyes, a very limited change, or I have no voice within powerful decision-making systems relevant to knowledge production in my field. It was a bit complicated to make an argument if I'm part of the same system or not, and if I am, how much I'm part of it. So below I will bring some short insights into my experiences and how I address problems related to colonial power and authority over representation. Going back to the point that I made about double colonial burden of post-Soviet region, which had been established as a result of Russian colonization of the former Soviet republics, and after the Soviet Union ended, other powers entered, as I said, different fields, such as economically, largely China, intellectually, North Atlantic scholarly engagement, American universities opened, etc. So during the imperial times of Russian terrorist regime, Russian scholars dominated within the field of data collection from the occupied territories of Tsarist Empire, I mean here Central Asia, and during the Soviet era, Russian scholars were predominantly leading the research in all of the Soviet republics, and the scholarly literature in any field of study was predominantly in Russian, with some limited translations available for the native scholars. Moscow was the center of research and ideological production, shaping academic discourses. Until today, remnants of this Soviet colonization of knowledge production in Central Asia exists in most of the disciplines. If you look at the textbooks or books that are available in the subject, of course, besides local histories, politics, economy, at least in Uzbekistan. When the post-Soviet space opened up to Western scholars, many made quick careers by traveling so-called virgin lands from a capitalist Western perspective. Everything seemed new, exciting, and new discourses were produced, this time not in Moscow, but in Washington, New York, Paris, and London or Manchester. The anthropological research of the region is still in the beginning stage, where some very basic issues and topics remain uncovered. Also, there is by now a good bulk of works produced by dominantly Western scholarship. Native anthropologists increasingly appear in the academic landscape in the West, still within limited space, with limited funds. There are very few native anthropologists who have a permanent position or in the decision-making positions within Western academic landscape. The position of scholars is important in considering the choice of funding, topics, research directions, policy formulations. Unfortunately, major funding comes from the West to the region. And those who make those decisions are mainly scholars of Western or European origin. Within this kind of hierarchically organized academic discourse production space, it's important to consider the issues of power and representation, as well as distribution of roles within the same system. In the field of Central Asian studies, Western scholars remain the most powerful players in the system of academic discourse production, and then the Russian scholars occupy some powerful positions backed by geopolitical standing within internal political landscape and access to the field. Of course, it's now decreasing with all these sanctions, and the Russian academia with limited financial means still remains a dominant, takes a dominant position within the post-Soviet system of discourse production. The last and the least attention is given to native researchers or scholars who are based in the region, who depend on the Russian system of academic publishing, because obviously a lot of publishing is done in Russian, and financially fully depend on Western funding, with some very limited exceptions of Kazakh universities, of course. What are important topics is part of this academic power game and is part of career-making strategies, not mentioning of financial interests. Halit's remark on this, Adib Halit's remark on the scholarship of Soviet Central Asia is very much telling. I quote, "Scholars who invoke post-colonial studies in the study of Central Asia have been very much interested in the cultural work of Soviet power, a much sexier topic than the history of cotton," end of quote. Participation of Central Asian scholars in academic discussions is limited to external funding, despite a scholar will be a full faculty member at a university or a research institute, whereas a faculty member or any scholar employed within Western academic organization will have a better access to financial means to take part in academic events. An encounter I will never forget, I experienced during one of the international conferences organized in Central Asia, funded by US organizations, which take place annually, once in Central Asia and once in America, shows these differences and result in grievances and frustrations. A local researcher came up to me and greeted me, I know her from earlier meetings, who shared her frustrations about the fact that she was not permitted to attend conference discussions since she could not afford very high registration fees for attending the conference. I was puzzled since I thought that someone who doesn't pay the registration fee for the conference, she cannot attend lunches or dinners or coffee breaks, but she could, in my eyes, attend discussions. Unfortunately, one of the organizers of this huge conference, a Harvard graduate and organizer of fundings, he told us they have high costs of organizing the event, and if people will be let in, then nobody will pay for the registration. The argument didn't sound convincing to me, considering the fact that a researcher who is a native of the region and that conference is taking place in the region, which is the main focus of the conference, had no access to the discussions because of the financial reasons. She left the avenue disappointedly and said she couldn't afford to be critical about the way the conference was organized, since she herself depends on the funds from the West. One cannot criticize something one might benefit from or financially depend from in the future or in the present moment. I saw the argument justified, since I myself was and am in the similar position. The monopoly over power to decide needs to be dissolved. and the decision-making system needs to be reconsidered, where native voices need to be better represented. I would like to bring some encounters from the field, since this is also an important field. I will try to be very brief. So I said that I conducted my anthropological fieldwork at home and also in Russia, working together with a human rights activist with whom I also published texts together. We presented our works together. And unfortunately, this colleague is sitting behind the bars in Tajikistan since March 2021 due to his activist work in Russia. Fortunately, not because of his work with me. And I met him in Moscow-based, he's a Moscow-based activist and lawyer in a conference organized by German and Swedish Turkish institutions, where also migrants themselves and also those who worked with NGOs were invited in 2015. I come back in a moment to my research assistant. So the event was organized with the aim to bring researchers, politicians, practitioners, and people in the field together to discuss daily problems of migrants in Russia. The format of the event allowed forum where researchers spoke about migrants' lives, and migrants spoke about their lives. These led to different kind of discussions than those usually we encounter in normal academic events. In the latter, scholars frequently distance themselves from the real-life concerns of those they study in order to analyze their material and contribute to the development of social theories. So delving too deeply into details of daily lives of their interlocutors are sometimes confronted with so what questions. The justification of these so what questions is that we are less seriously interested in the lives of people we study, but rather focus on our personal careers, advancement of the discipline. As a native anthropologist, I argue, following Smith, that what is important for me is to contribute to the improvement of lives back home or where I worked. Moreover, even if we concentrate on theory production, it's imperative to critically question imported epistemologies, be it Russian or whatever, and reflect on the modes of knowing that are connected to the region where we live or where we work. As a researcher who was partly educated in the West and who is striving for a career, I understand other researchers who have to deal with the same dilemmas. Simultaneously, I'm a migrant myself who originated from the country I studied anthropologically in order to make my own career in the West. And I also understand the migrants who demand solutions and not academic texts, which was made clear by migrant participants in Turkey. Studying societal problems for the purposes of contributing to theories explaining human behavior is obviously not so relevant for those who we study. How we can continue the research in the way that we serve not only our discipline or our careers, but also return something of lasting value to people. In academia, some collaborations have been made with Western institutions in Central Asia and individual scholars from the West. And how much, the question remains, how much lasting effect did these entanglements produce? And even if these endeavors helped to produce a new generation of Central Asian scholars, the epistemological power hierarchies remained largely in place and have even been increased. These repeated implicitly a development that had started decades earlier when the Bolsheviks had taken control over Central Asia and turned Khanates into Soviet republics. Local traditions of knowledge were undermined and banned. Russian socialist perspectives replaced them. Institutions of higher learning were founded and promoted imported knowledge in Russian. After the 90s, the local scholarship was forced to follow discourses produced in Paris, Harvard, Yale. As my colleague who is based in Uzbekistan said, we're drowning in scopusomania. The issue of the field assistants and the power differences in the field, which is very important still to me, for me, is a long debated topic. So I will only share here with some of my own experience of establishing field collaboration. I also will touch on some uneasy encounters I faced interacting with Western colleagues I continued my contact with an active member of migration organizations where I wanted to do my fieldwork, and these happened to be the same contact of my Western colleague. To my surprise, several colleagues from Europe showed a kind of disapproval of the fact of my intention to collaborate with the same persons they had as research assistants in the past. The disapproval was expressed in such comments like, well, I wouldn't recommend this person, as this person might be working with the security services. This is the person. Or ask better Mrs. So-and-so who worked with him what she thinks about your plans. And later, finding out that the relations of the person with whom I worked then also later were destroyed with the same colleagues who worked with the same person in the past. It came as a surprise to me, as it looked like as if scholars from Western Europe could be owning other persons in the field. The remarks he made about her disappointment with him was, I quote, "Does she think she owns me? I can work with whoever I want to," end of quote. I have not raised further this incident as one of those who made the remark about this is much powerful by now, the professor at one of the universities like Cambridge, Oxford, Harvard like. I have no space to talk about citation politics here, but I can say that what I have observed so far in my 15 years of conducting research and publishing, there's some kind of politics of citing research. Also, the field of Central Asian studies is not so big to argue we cannot cite everything. In the field of Central Asian studies, there are several networks around powerful scholars who have successful academic careers and who occupy important positions, important decision-making positions, while citation politics circulates about who cites whom. This resulted in the new discussion in the couple of years among local researchers who became in the meantime also more or less successful and started to take part in academic discussions about supporting and promoting works written by native anthropologists from Central Asia. I hope that these discussions will continue and contribute to the future decolonizing anthropology in Central Asia. So I would like to end my talk today with these citations that I mentioned at the very beginning of my talk, because they are still making me busy, and I'm thinking about them, about this review that you can read. These are the citations from this review that I received from Anthropology Today. Thank you very much. I hope that I didn't take so much time. I think I'm very much on time, so I don't read these citations aloud.
Thank you very much, Rano. So, I think you can switch off get out of the presentation mode. So yeah, we can open our debate. Is it, by the way, do I have some, I will stop the recording.